Randall Smith out at Mesa Boogie. Okay, now I know this story is a few days old, and but thinking back on it, I just had to comment on this because the first really good tube amp that I ever owned was a Mesa Boogie S.O.B. And I bought that amp at Daddy's Junkie Music in Boston, right across from Berkeley, while I was attending Berkeley. Before I left high school, I went to Berkeley for the summer. And then I took that 412 cab, the 412 white, Boogie cab that said Boogie on it, and that Boogie S.O.B head, that white, 100-watt head, and I took that back down to Williamsburg, Virginia, and played in all kinds of bands, garage bands back in the day. And then that amplifier is the amplifier that I packed into my B2000 pickup truck and drove out to the Sunset Strip. And, some of my first shows on the Sunset Strip were that amp, me just plugged straight into that amp and had the gain dialed in, and then it had a little limiter on it so I could get my sound without really taking people's heads off. But that was my sound, and for a long time, I would use Mesa Boogie amps. I had, over the years, let's see, and these amps became kind of iconic parts of my career, getting the amp and then taking it as far as I could. And that Mesa S.O.B lasted me a long time on some of my, all through my garage band days, and then taking it out to the Sunset Strip and playing, the Roxy and then some of the venues outside of town, like the Waters Club and all that. I used that amp a lot, and I really liked that amp, and I miss that amp because I eventually traded it in on a Marshall rig because that was kind of what everybody was playing on the Strip at the time. But man, that Mesa Boogie S.O.B was a killer amp. And man, I miss that rig. That would be, if I could get a brand new version of that, that would be something I would really like to have again. But then, I moved on to Marshall. But I can remember moving back to when I moved to Nashville. And, I at the time, but when I left, I was trying to build a studio rack setup, but that didn't really serve me well playing in the clubs in Nashville. So I knew I had to get a combo amp. And I remember going down to a store in Nashville in Madison, and it was before it became Sam Ash. It was a different music store in the same location, but they had Mesa Boogie amps. And I remember it was a Mesa Maverick, I believe, and it had the white, kind of tan grill and the white kind of Tolex. And that was a great sounding, vintage style amp. And I would run, that's when I started getting into pedals. And I would run, a few pedals in front of that. And I believe it was a 2-channel amp, if I remember correctly. And that was a great sounding rig, and I used that on a lot of gigs. I mean, it was fairly easy to carry in and carry out, although Mesa amps always had some heft to them. And that amp served me well for a lot of years playing, little club gigs and stuff around Nashville. And then, at some point, I was playing the clubs and doing all that. And I think what I did is I got a few bucks maybe for Christmas one year or something. And I decided I'm going to get a Mesa Dual Rectifier head because I was still, had my toes dipped in the rock and roll, thing. And yeah, I never really moved to Nashville to be a country player. So I bought a Mesa Dual Rectifier, and it was the early version where there was just 2 channels, clean and dirty. And it was a 100-watt amp. And that was like the ultimate, amp at the time as far as having gain and having tone. And that amp I used to record all the guitar parts on Rapneck's Deliverance album. And that was the project that, sort of got me out of really crappy apartments and kind of, we got a record deal out of that. We were signed with Beyond Records out in Los Angeles, and that gave us a little bit of money that we could, kind of further our careers. And, it was kind of a feather in the cap. Like, look, I'd set out to get a record deal and ended up getting a record deal as a rapper, but I played all the guitars on that album, and that Mesa Dual Rectifier was a huge part of the sound. And then over the years, I think the next amp that I got, Mesa amp that I got was, I can't think of the name of it, but it was an amp that was plagued with problems. It had 3 channels. I can't remember the name. Please let me know in the comments if you remember it. But it had 3 channels, and it was a very versatile amp. But that amp had a problem with the pots, and I guess it had issues right out of the gate. And I would get it repaired, and then it would have to go back in and all that. But I used that amp to record almost all the guitars on the Suitcase Pimp's Love Is Grand album. I used that and the Dual Rectifier, but that 3-channel Mesa amp, and like I said, I can't remember what that was called, and then it's been discontinued since. But that was a super versatile amp and a super great sounding amp that I could get a lot of tones out of, and I knew out of each channel how to get the different tones. So I was able to take that one combo amp, and it was me and another guitar player on Suitcase Pimps, and we got almost all of the guitar tones out of that amp, despite the fact that the amp had issues. It was a great sounding amp. And then after that, on my time with Colt Ford. Now, with Colt Ford, I used Splon amps, and I used Friedman amps, and I used Bogner amps. But there was a while there where I rediscovered the Mesa Stiletto, and I was able to get a Mesa Stiletto somewhere, I think maybe a Guitar Center, for like $600. And that was very similar sounding to the Friedman, the Friedman BE100 that I had. And I was like, man, this is a great backup amp for my rig, because I didn't want to buy 2 Friedman BE100s. So the Mesa Stiletto was a great backup to the Friedman BE100. And I would say, if you can't afford a Friedman BE100 and that's what you want, check out a Mesa Stiletto. They are Marshall-styled amps, and I was able to dial mine in to sound a lot like the BE100. So it was a great backup to that amp. So I have a long history with Mesa amps and using them. And I know Nashville's not really a place that embraced those amps that much. Nashville's always been more of a Fender and the old blackface and tweed amps and stuff like that. And then, some of the studio guys would use old Marshalls or Matchless or, stuff like that. And Mesa Boogie was very rarely you would see something like that in a studio. But I'm not the typical Nashville guy, so I would always, I would listen with my ears and decide, hey, I can get a Fender style tone out of this amp, or hey, I can get this, or I can, even a dual rectifier, you can dial those amps in to get some different sounds. And, so Mesa was a big part of my career. And so I had to comment on this. Randall Smith 3 years after Mesa was, bought out by Gibson, they've now announced that Randall Smith has completed his tenure, with Mesa Boogie. And so it was a very brief statement. Let me see exactly what it said. So Gibson put out a statement saying Randall Smith has completed his time, completed his time with Gibson as a master designer and pioneer of Mesa Boogie. That is sort of an insult to sum up a guy who was a legend in the amp field. Whether you like Mesa Boogie amps or you don't, or maybe you're a repair guy and you're not real fond of working on those amps, I understand there's some design issues potentially with Mesa stuff, but for the most part, most people really like the amps. And, he's a legend in amp building. I mean, he's a guy started in the 60s modifying Fender amps and created the original Boogie kind of as a joke, he took a Princeton and just beefed it up and made it so it would crank, and Santana saying, man, that amp really boogies. And that's where Boogie came from. I always liked the Mesa amps that just said Boogie on it. I just always thought, it was a 70s thing. Hey, man, let's boogie. It was always a kind of a retro thing to say. But, man, it's kind of a slap in the face to just say, oh, he has completed his time with Gibson and as a master designer of Mesa Boogie. Man, but, the guy is of the age, and he's like 78 years old or something like that. So I get it, man. He might be done. Is he going to go off and start another company? Well, they may have made him sign something, a non-compete or something, so that he can't. I don't know if this has something to do with the Gibson amps that were designed. I had some issues with the tubes being inside the chassis and sealed up. I wouldn't touch one of those amps with a 10-foot pole. But that's just me, and I know some people probably love those amps and, love everything they do. I tend to look at amp design and amp building from a player's perspective and wanting something that's extremely reliable, wanting something that's very easy to fix, something that's made with parts that are made to last. And I understand pretty much all amps have some issues that some of these channels that I like to watch, whether it's the Guitologist or Psionic Audio, I like watching their videos because they kind of break it down and go, man, look at this. And you see the inside of these amps, or you see the repeated issues that some of these amps have. And it scares me away from buying these amps. Ultimately, I don't want to buy something that's a repair project. And like I said, I've had Mesa amps in the past where it was like constantly in and out of the shop. And, Mesa tried to help. They would send parts and my guy would put the new parts in and all that. But, the particular amp that I had, it had like 20 some knobs on the front and every one of them needed to be replaced. And that's an insane job. Those amps they're not point to point. They're not simple circuits. They're very complex circuits. And so for somebody to try to take it apart, you run the risk of breaking the PCB board and all this. So, I don't know why Gibson chose to do what they did, but I do have concern for the future of Mesa. Without the guy, it'd be like Dave Friedman leaving Friedman amps. I'd be like, dude, he is the amps. Friedman is Friedman amps. Randall Smith is Mesa Boogie amps. Leo Fender stepped away from Fender a long time ago, and honestly, it went downhill a lot. That's when the Silverface amps came. They weren't as good as the Blackface. and gradually, and now you have production the way it is now. And, Fender amps aren't built the same as they were back in the day. They do offer point-to-point amps, and I applaud them for doing that. But you know what? It used to be the regular old deluxe you would buy in the 60s. It was a hand-wired amp. So this is going to be interesting to see what happens with Randall Smith gone from Gibson. Is Gibson just doing Gibson stuff? And I've been very critical on this channel of Gibson and their pricing, and they're getting rid of their lower-priced USA-made guitars and kind of replacing them with what I feel is an inferior line of guitars. But, I don't feel this is a good thing. But then again, the guy is old enough and at the point where he deserves a chance, if he wants to retire. So we'll have to keep our eyes on Gibson, keep an eye on Mesa Boogie, and hope that this is not a huge mistake.